Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This is Carrie Freed from the Office of Inclusive Excellence.
And this is Dr. Alyssa Alonso with the Student Counseling Center.
And we are back with our third of four podcast recaps during our Women's Empowerment Bootcamp here at UIndy. This week, we are talking about calming the storm and conflict resolution, what it looks like to be in conflict, how does it feel, and how do we get ourselves out of it? So I'm really excited about this week. I think we had a great, fruitful conversation yet again. Thank you to our participants who were always willing to share and be vulnerable with us in our spaces. Today's topic is conflict resolution, like I mentioned, and the question that was proposed to the group is, what is a conflict?
And we very purposefully left that as broad as possible because we really wanted to challenge our members to be creative in thinking about what a conflict is. A lot of the times we have a lot of negative associations around conflict and confrontation, and we really wanted to try to get our members to dig into that.
Absolutely. So some of the things that they talked about was, I know I'm in conflict when I feel that a boundary has gotten violated. So a boundary I established, somebody crossed my boundary, and now I have a conflict. They also mentioned they might have a conflict when a value that they've established isn't being met or isn't being attended to like they thought it should. Someone said a conflict interferes with regularly scheduled programming. So absolutely, sometimes conflict comes out of nowhere and we don't expect it, but it does cause us to kind of pause and take a break out of our regular scheduled programming and address it. And they also talked about conflict being something that deals with opposing ideas, values, or perspectives. I thought that was a great way to get us started, but we really wanted to dig a little deeper too, because we might know what conflict is, but I think on the other hand, we might be even more lost in terms of what conflict looks like. So in that way, we talked a lot about the different types of conflict, and how sometimes conflict is really hot and heated and in the moment, right? If you're someone that maybe grew up in a household in which conflict did look like screaming and yelling and being loud and drawing attention, right? Then you might be used to conflict, or you might assume conflicts looks like arguments or screaming matches or something like that. But there are others of us who are more familiar with conflict that's kind of icy and cold. So that might look like, people isolating themselves from you. Stonewalling is something that I think is something people don't know is happening to them often, right? Or, in today's society, we might call stonewalling ghosting. That might be another substitute for that. And sometimes conflict can look very subjective, right? So between two people or a group of people, conflict could be about one thing, but the real issue could be more about how I felt and how I reacted to the situation or the stimulus that took place.
Right. And so thinking about examples of like, okay, what is the conflict actually about? Is it about the fact that, my roommate's not cleaning up her side of the kitchen? Or is it really about the fact like, I feel like she's not respecting my space. I feel like she's not doing her part. I feel like my feelings are hurt. And now I'm feeling like anxious and uncomfortable in our space.
Right. Absolutely. And I think too, our participants did a really good job of imagining how they manage conflict too. One of them had a really great breakthrough moment when she was like, she realized, oh, I'm the ghoster. I'm the stonewaller. I'm the one that sees conflict coming and says, I'm just going to back away and dip out of that. And I think another part of our empowerment camp is not only to talk about in this conditioning of womanhood, how women receive conflict, right? But how we show up in conflict as well. And how maybe sometimes how we show up isn't the best way to get the job done. But that led into a conversation about, in the conditioning of womanhood, what is a woman, quote unquote's role in conflict, right? And sometimes even, is it appropriate for her to participate in conflict in the first place?
Yeah, we had a really fruitful discussion around like those messages that group members received when growing up around like, well, you should take the high road, be the bigger person. Or also, we had some group members sharing like they were advised to make sure they got their needs met.
Yeah.
Do what they needed to do
Right.
in the conflict, speak out for themselves.
Right.
So a really wide perspective and like what it means to be a woman in situations that can lead to conflict.
And I would say too, culturally in the room, our participants of color often felt like they were more encouraged to, I don't want to say participate in conflict, but more encouraged to get their needs met, like you said, more encouraged to reinforce their boundaries. Whereas the people in the majority of our room were really more feeling like, no, the messages I've received have really been more like turn the other cheek, look away, don't cause a scene, don't make a big deal, right? We often talked about, taking up space, right? And in conflict, or if I have a conflict, or if my boundary is violated, how much space am I allowed to take up? And sometimes we often think about women who walk into spaces and are told to be a lot smaller than they actually are told that their feelings aren't as valid as they think that they're portraying that they are, right? And sometimes women walk into conflict and that puts them in jeopardy. We talked about the history of womanhood. And when we look at a woman's independence in terms of how easily she could walk away from a situation that was harmful to her, or how easily she was able to, uproot her kids and move to a different place, or remove herself from a situation that was harmful to her and her family. That's a relatively new concept in the world's history, right? And there are still some places in the world in which women and their boundaries and their values aren't really the topic of discussion. And oftentimes in conflict, they're asked to take the back seat.
Yeah, and that was definitely an area that we tried to expand on, was this idea of reflecting, asking our members and you as our listeners to reflect on your own lives and where those messages you've received around conflict have come from, and then how they apply to you currently, taking into account this history in the condition of womanhood.
As you were just talking about that, I was thinking a little bit more about, I think Gen Z, and something I really love about Gen Z, I see Gen Z as generational curse breakers. I think there are lots of things about Gen Z that are like the antithesis of how the world's always been, right? Gen Z shows up authentically. They expect you to show up authentically. And if they sense that you're not being authentic, they're disengaged, right? That's something that we're experiencing at our university a lot. And I really admire the ability to sit and be reflective on one's own contribution to a space, right? And there were so many moments in our session yesterday in which it wasn't so much like, well, this is how people have conflict with me. It was, oh, this is the role that I've been playing in conflict. And these might be the ways in which I'm not getting my needs met because of how I'm showing up, right? There was a student who mentioned, well, I can handle feeling bad. I don't want the other person to handle feeling bad. And we had a lot of discussion about, well, don't you deserve to feel good, right? Don't you deserve to have your needs met? And don't you deserve to be in spaces in which you're comfortable? And yes, you might be strong enough to handle big feelings. Does that also mean that you're deserving to have negative big feelings, or to sit with them for a long time, or to have someone constantly violate your boundary because you don't think they can handle being told that they're violating your boundary, right? I think for a lot of women, especially women who kind of identify with that people pleaser mentality, that fixer mentality, they assume that that's their role, is to absorb the emotions of others, take the brunt of it, right? And then move on and let other people kind of have their moment. But we deserve to have our moment. We absolutely deserve to have our moment. So more of our conversation led into what happens when we're in that conflict, right? And what kind of skills do I need to manage it more effectively?
Well, and that really is what transitioned us to one of the exercises we did in the group. So one thing that we did was we created a scenario. And this was a scenario of two roommates in a conflict with trying to be as realistic as possible. And what we challenged our members to do was to be the judge in this scenario, who had the most compelling evidence on their side of the conflict, on who was right. And what we really encouraged our members to reflect on was all the nuances and the details in this conflict, and then how they themselves might have reacted in this certain conflict. And it led to a really fruitful discussion, talking a lot about how we hold ourselves accountable in spaces, how we hold other people accountable, what that looks like when we've established a boundary with somebody, and how to maintain that boundary.
Mm-hmm. And I think something we touched on a lot was this really delicate balance. And I think a lot of those of us who've been conditioned in womanhood struggle with is the reason sometimes that we forego establishing that boundary is because for some reason the relationship is more important than having my boundary respected. Mm-hmm. And so, if this conflict goes bad, our relationship then could go bad, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to control for this by not bringing it up. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to start a fight. I'm not going to say something. I'm not going to, or on the opposite, right? If this goes bad, the relationship could be over. So I need to fix it now. We need to do something about it. This is an urgent matter, right? Mm-hmm. And balancing the line of, okay, I'm going to withdraw, or okay, I'm going to engage, can be really challenging. And it can also be discouraging when you've gotten the courage to finally establish that boundary and hold it steady, and then someone still disrespects it.
Well, and this only becomes more complicated when you introduce big, intense emotions into it. One thing that we talked about was all the wide range of emotions that can come up, from anger and resentment, annoyance, frustration, irritability, but also like emotions like hurt, pain, sadness, like betrayal or disappointment with someone. Mm-hmm. Not to mention feeling anxious or scared about what the results of the relationship might be. Mm-hmm. So when you have these big, intense emotions, it makes it really difficult to then think, well, what do I even do in this situation?
Yeah. Or it's hard not to lead into those anxious rabbit hole thoughts, right? Well, mm-hmm. This relationship isn't worth it anymore because we've had this big argument, and now I don't know what to do. And now I'm just feeling all these feelings, and I'm so hurt and I'm so upset, and we're just done and it's over. Right. Mm-hmm. Or my friend is violating my boundary and they don't care about me. I think we talked a lot about that character attribution, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of this conflict being about the objective thing that happened, right? The actual event that occurred. Sometimes conflict can get so big and our emotions can get so big that now I'm looking at your character and questioning whether or not you're someone I trust, whether or not you're someone I want to be around. And those can be really complicated decisions to make in a spur of a moment. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that leads us into thinking about the patterns of thought that we can establish. So one thing that we talked about during the workshop was what's called thought distortions. So thought distortions are different styles of thinking that can get established in a bunch of different ways that are generally unhelpful. So one big one that we talked about was the all or nothing thought pattern, where it's either you're trust this person and you want to be best friends with them, ride or die, or you never want to see them again. They're dead to you, mm-hmm. right? That you're all or you're nothing. And when you fall into this thought pattern, particularly when you're feeling these big, intense emotions, you can make some snap decisions where suddenly you're like cursing somebody out who you actually is a really good friend of yours that you care about.
Right.
Or you end up deciding like, I just never want to speak to this person again, and they're blocked, and that you cut them out of your life.
Right.
It's hard to go to that all or nothing thought pattern, because then suddenly like you end up with broken relationships.
Yeah. And you've made decisions that you might want to change once those big feelings kind of calm down and you're feeling a little bit more grounded. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes I'm very guilty of this, of thinking, if I'm in the middle of a conflict, that right now, right this second, the conflict needs to be resolved, right? Everything needs to be resolved in this conversation. And if it's not resolved in this conversation, then the whole conflict is still going on, or there's still a big problem. But sometimes like we need space to breathe. And that just because I'm in a conflict today doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be in a conflict a week from now. And it definitely doesn't necessarily mean that our whole relationship is shattered, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe after the conflict, I do realize that I need to establish new boundaries with you, mm-hmm. right? Maybe my level of closeness with you is a little less than it was before, or maybe, maybe it's a moment for us to bond a little bit more. And maybe now after this conflict, I've had a new level of understanding for you and our relationship is closer. There are possibilities in between that this or that, that I think we're really trying to hit for our listeners and our participants, is that not all things have to be all in or all out. And when you're in that conflict, those big emotions are there to try to keep us safe. And so, of course, they're going to try to get you all in or all out because they're trying to get you back to safety. They're trying to get you back to that ground zero. But we know that sometimes it's not that easy, right? We're not out here in the wild running from a predator and having to make a split decision that is life or death. When we have a conflict, most of the time it's not life or death. So there is space to breathe and there is space to sit in it for a second. It might be very uncomfortable to sit in those big feelings and to wait until they kind of calm down and you're back and centered. But you can make so much more educated decisions, and you can also make decisions that don't stick you in this, I've ruined everything, or I'm fully committed, or, you know, that binary that this or that keeps us in.
Well, and we really wanted to connect this back to the session, the workshop that we had previously on knowing your worth and knowing your values. Because when you make those big decisions, we want them to come from a place of what you value. If you say that you value your friendships and then you're choosing to engage in a conflict in a way that's not helping you get your needs met and not helping you develop the types of friendships that you want to have, then you're doing yourself a disservice in knowing your own worth and giving yourself that value. We want you to validate your emotions. Yes. Validating those intense emotions is so critical. And also, we don't need to make decisions from the perspective of those intense emotions.
Right. Absolutely. Because go ahead.
Well, because at the end of the day, we may end up having to make a decision where maybe you do end up ending a relationship with somebody.
Right.
That might be a decision you got to make, and it's a painful one, or it can be a painful one. And if it comes from a place of reflection and intentionality based on what you value, you can feel a lot better about that decision moving forward. Yes,
absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because I think that's the other thing is we get really nervous and scared about the results of a conflict, right? And I think you're so right. When I look at my boundaries and I look at my values, and when I say these are the things that are most important to me, these are the things that make me feel safe, that I'm looking for in my relationships. Remember, we're fact finders, right? Our brains are looking for information all the time. And that's the information when you're in that big feeling that you need to resort back to, right? Is this something that is really a part of the core things that I care about? Is this in line with those core things? Is it in line with the boundaries that I've set? Do I still feel comfortable with the boundaries that I've set? If you're not checking those certain boxes, that's when maybe a decision to terminate a relationship or change a relationship or friendship, whatever the case may be, might come in. But it doesn't necessarily have to come in just because you're feeling really uncomfortable for a moment, right? And that's the difference we're trying to make. Somebody might invoke a big reaction out of you, whether that's a hot reaction, that's screaming, that's yelling, that you're sweating, your ears are hot, whether it's one of those, or whether it's that icy feeling, right? The stonewalling, the ghosting, either way, those are two places to be either on the receiving end or on the giving end that can be really uncomfortable. It's not those feelings that are the facts that you're looking for to make a decision. It's going back to your values and saying, is this something that I'm still in line with? And is it still in line with me? And is it something I want to continue and nurture and work on and take time to improve? Or is this the end of the road? And that's okay. But I think you're right. It so does make the decision a lot more true for me. And it takes away a little bit of that fear of regret and fear of guilt, right? When I'm looking and I'm like, no, this really isn't the best situation for me. So I need to go, right? And I feel like at that moment too is when that self-love starts pouring in a lot more, right? Because you're not abandoning yourself for the sake of someone else's feelings and emotions. You're really looking and making decisions that are based on what's right and what's true for you. And it's so much more affirming and empowering, of course.
Well, and that's really why how we structured the challenge for the week was, how do we get from that place of these intense emotions where we allow ourselves to validate them and then de-escalate ourselves to a place where we can see our values and figure out where we want to be at and make some of these big decisions that we want to make. So the challenge for the week was really around practicing skills for emotion regulation. So essentially what emotion regulation is it's a variety of different skills, but they allow you to de-escalate from these very intense emotions to a place where you're feeling more calm and more grounded. So our participants were given a sheet with 4 different emotion regulation skills to select one that they thought would be the most helpful for them to practice for the following week. So a brief recap of the emotion regulation skills are the first one is called please, and it's focusing on your body and how your body and mind are closely linked, where please is an acronym where PL stands for treat any physical illnesses you have. E is eat healthy. A, avoid mood altering drugs. S, sleep well. And E is exercise. So using please as a strategy for emotion regulation helps you link your body and your mind together to help you remember the important aspects in your connection to yourself. The next emotion regulation skill is around paying attention to positive events. It's human nature for our brains to catch on difficult or negative things, and like such as hearing criticism. So this emotion regulation skill is about being mindful and attentive of positive things that happen in your day-to-day life. So for example, taking a walk, having a good unrushed meal, taking time to visit with family and friends, putting on some headphones and just doing nothing but listen to your music. Right? The next emotion regulation skill is looking at checking the facts. Carrie's mentioned we are fact finders, right? So checking the facts is asking yourself a few questions. 1, what event is triggering my emotions? 2, what interpretations or assumptions am I making about this event? And 3, does my emotion and its intensity match the facts of the situation? Or does it just match my assumptions of the situation? Right? And the fourth and final emotion regulation skill is called opposite action. So it's when you're experiencing emotion, a lot of the times we have like a gut reaction. So if we're angry, we might want to argue. If we're sad, we might want to withdraw and isolate ourselves. So opposite action as a skill is doing the opposite of what that instinct is. So if you get angry and your instinct is to yell, instead talk as quietly as you can. If you get sad and your instinct is to withdraw and like pull back and isolate yourself, it's make specific plans with friends and carry those plans through. Okay. So acting in the opposite direction of what you would normally do. Okay. So these are the 4 emotion regulation skills that we invited our participants to pick one from and then practice throughout the week for the challenge.
Yeah. And quite a challenge those are. Ooh, I'm sitting here thinking, wow, that'd be kind of hard for me to do even. So that's conflict resolution for this week. I think we had a great conversation, and I feel I walked away feeling a lot more confident in terms of remembering that my feelings are important and remembering that having a big feeling does not mean that I'm out of control or that I can't manage myself. Big feelings come. And in the middle of conflict, nonetheless, right, when we're dealing with somebody else's big feeling. But the important part is to know that you are still in control of the moment because you're in control of yourself. And you have the ability to get yourself back to ground zero and make a decision that feels true for you because you've looked at your values, you've looked at your boundaries and said, okay, these are the things that are important to me. And out of this conflict, this is what I want to come out of it. It's a challenge for sure. But I think with a little practice, you'll walk away feeling a lot more empowered about the decisions you make and the relationships and the friendships that you find. Yeah. So come back next week for our 4th and final podcast recap. We will be talking about radical self-love and what it looks like to start loving yourself out of love and not out of shame. So I'm so excited to wrap up our podcast series next week. Try out the challenge this week. See how it feels to regulate yourself, to go into that conflict with bravery and kindness for yourself and for others. And as always, good luck out there in the great beyond, and we'll see you next time.